This is not a Hollywood conspiracy theory, nor is it a cheap internet fabrication. What surfaced bears the weight of a confidential file, the kind that forces investigators to rethink everything they thought they knew. The truth emerged from the core of rehearsal footage, once dismissed as harmless, footage in which Michael Jackson appeared at once breathtakingly luminous and painfully fragile. The so-called leaked video does not capture his final moments. Instead, it pries open a far more unsettling conclusion. The real killer was not hiding in the shadows. It was operating in plain sight, amid relentless pressure, years of cultivated silence, and a cascading series of institutional and personal failures. Viewed through the lens of a cold, methodical investigation, almost as if drawn from an interagency case file, this is not merely the story of a legend's death. It is the documented unraveling of a man forced to endure expectations beyond human limits. Before we examine the details that reshaped public understanding of his final days, remember to follow and subscribe so you never miss the truths that live behind the spotlight. From the first frames alone, a troubling contradiction asserts itself. Michael Jackson steps onto the rehearsal floor noticeably lean, his shoulders carrying an unfamiliar heaviness, his timing occasionally lagging just behind the beat. And then, without warning, the music locks in, and the room ignites with that unmistakable, razor-edged force the world had come to know. This is not reconstruction or second-hand testimony. It is preserved in the official rehearsal recordings, for this is it. Materials later mislabeled for dramatic effect as leaked. What unsettles the trained observer is not the footage itself, but what it documents. An icon no longer at his physical apex, yet unwilling to concede even a fraction of a measure. The result is a dual image, commanding and compromised, that leaves viewers transfixed and uneasy, sensing that beneath the precision was a body being driven past its own warning signals. Inside that sealed rehearsal environment, devoid of spectacle or applause, the routine is mechanical. Music starts, music stops, again and again. Michael speaks sparingly. Multiple accounts describe him relying more on gestures than words, his stare fixed with an intensity that bordered on isolation. During breaks, he would remain motionless for extended periods, seated, shoulders against the chair, head inclined forward, as if rationing what little energy remained. These are minor details, easily dismissed because they lack sensational appeal, yet collectively they produce a claustrophobic portrait. Here stood a black artist conditioned from childhood to meet impossible standards, dissected for his appearance and every movement, now facing a return the world demanded while standing ready to pass judgment. The pressure required no narration. It lingered in the silences between tracks and in the deliberate breath Michael took before rising to begin again. It was from moments like these that rumors of leaked footage where it all ends spread with viral speed. But when speculation is stripped away from verifiable record, as any disciplined review would require, what remains are rehearsal videos and posthumously released audio recordings. There were no hidden cameras in private spaces. There is no concealed final tape. This has been established, yet factual clarity rarely satisfies public appetite. Audiences sought more than chronology. They wanted motive, antagonist, resolution. Into that vacuum emerged the notion of a real killer, despite mounting indicators pointing instead to cumulative exhaustion. When Michael's voice recording surfaced, many heard fragility for the first time. Speech slowed, thoughts fragmented, as if cognition itself struggled to keep pace. This was not proof of orchestration. It was evidence of a man in urgent need of rest. Context only deepens the assessment. This Is It was not a casual comeback. It was a massive contractual undertaking executed under the assumption that the legend remained unbreakable. Family members would later confirm Michael's long-standing struggle with natural sleep, a detail that appears ordinary until viewed as a sustained physiological burden. In the rehearsal hall, no one barked orders or applied visible force. The pressure was quieter, more insidious. No one wanted to be the first to say, "Stop," because stopping meant acknowledging limits, something Michael had spent a lifetime defying. For a black performer who had fought relentlessly to claim and hold center stage, withdrawal was never a viable option, even as his body signaled distress. Crew members quietly shared that on certain days Michael arrived visibly depleted, and once the music ended, murmured that he was too tired for today. These accounts remain anecdotal and absent from formal documentation, but they align with the broader pattern. They sharpen the central conflict, a man aware he was nearing collapse, yet incapable of granting himself pause. He continued refining steps, requesting repeats, pursuing the same perfection that had built his legacy. At this stage, that perfectionism no longer elevated. It constricted, tightening gradually, leaving no margin for recovery. For those watching this narrative unfold, the emotional response is divided. Some were raised on his music, seeing him as a barrier breaker who reshaped culture. Others knew him chiefly through controversy. Faced with rehearsal footage of a fatigued Michael Jackson, both groups experienced discomfort, empathy colliding with disbelief. It becomes easier to accept myths of leaked footage than to confront the unadorned reality. At this juncture, no conspiracy was required, no singular villain necessary. The tragedy, if one traces it honestly, began with prolonged silence, with a man long accustomed to scrutiny who had nowhere left to rest. Those rehearsal tapes, unremarkable on their surface, now read like a preface, the point at which the divide between the legend and the man began to fracture, quietly and beyond repair. The silence inside the rehearsal hall was more than the absence of sound. It was the kind of silence that compels people to internalize what they dare not articulate. Michael Jackson understood the unspoken language of those watching him. Nothing needed to be said, yet everything was visible. His body was struggling to keep up with the tempo he himself had set decades earlier. The This Is It rehearsal recordings show him standing at center floor, hands braced on his hips, breath visibly strained, only to push himself upright moments later and move as though the pause had never occurred. That abrupt shift is what arrests the viewer. It reads like a silent declaration. Whatever the cost, he would not yield. From there, the phrase leaked footage began to signify something else entirely. Not a breach of privacy, but an unintentional exposure of truth. In these recordings, Jackson is not performing for an audience or the lens. The familiar smile is absent. The spark that once disarmed stadiums is replaced by a severe inward focus. He stops tracks mid-run, corrects minute details, orders a restart. Crew members later recalled that he rarely raised his voice, yet tension never left the room. It did not erupt. It lingered. Few observers paid attention to how he often shifted his weight during rest periods, standing slightly off-center, as if testing which posture demanded less from his body. Such observations never became headlines, but to a trained eye, they were indicators, early signals that something was amiss. And it was precisely this unease that later fueled the search for a real killer to assign blame. At that stage, there were no documents suggesting a plot, no evidence of an unseen hand. There was only pressure, contractual, professional, and cultural. Jackson, a black artist who had navigated extraordinary scrutiny to reach the apex of global fame, understood that retreat could be read as defeat. That is where the damage resided. No one had to verbalize it. The expectation was omnipresent. On occasion, when he sat during breaks, his gaze drifted past the mirrors and the people, settling nowhere in particular. Those moments, brief and unguarded, were perhaps the only times he was not required to prove himself. Removed from context, they were later distorted online into evidence supporting endless theories. Rumors of unreleased tapes spread rapidly, not because they were substantiated, but because they aligned with a familiar narrative impulse. The public wanted to believe something was concealed, that exhaustion alone could not explain the outcome. Yet verified records tell a far more restrained and painful story. There was no hidden camera documenting his final private hours, no tape sealed away as contraband. What exists are sanctioned rehearsal films and audio notes released after his death. In them, Jackson speaks softly about music, about completeness, about beauty. His cadence is occasionally slow, but there is no hint of a dark secret. Ironically, that ordinariness only intensified speculation, leaving space for imagination to manufacture what facts would not. One detail seldom emphasized, yet revealing, was Jackson's insistence that rehearsal lighting and sound replicate live performance conditions as closely as possible. He did not treat rehearsals as preparation. He treated them as existence. Every run-through was a performance, and when life becomes performance, rest becomes a liability. Family members would later confirm that he suffered from severe sleep disturbances, a documented condition, not conjecture. At the time, this information was not public, turning visible fatigue into raw material for sensational interpretation. Leaked footage thus evolved into shorthand for something more unsettling: the public witnessing vulnerability they were never meant to see. Several staff members recalled that Jackson often arrived early, sitting alone in the darkened hall before rehearsals began. There is no visual record of this, only testimony, but it aligns closely with what the cameras did capture. A man conditioned to live under constant illumination, seeking darkness to collect himself. What occupied his thoughts in those moments remains unknowable, and speculation serves no purpose. What is evident is the isolation, visible when he stands alone at center stage, surrounded by empty space. For audiences who viewed him as a symbol of transcendence over prejudice, that image resonates deeply. It underscores a truth rarely acknowledged: achievement extracts costs that are seldom itemized. At this juncture, the audience response is defined by contradiction. They wish to preserve the invincible figure of memory, yet cannot ignore the signs of strain. This dissonance makes extreme explanations appealing. A named real killer offers closure, a focal point for grief. The verified record offers no such convenience. There was no single perpetrator, only accumulated pressure. No dramatic moment preserved on tape, only repetition, rehearsal after rehearsal, until recovery was no longer possible. And no proven conspiracy, only the extended quiet of those around him, uncertain how or whether to intervene. Placed in proper context, these rehearsal films are not sensational leaks. They are documentation of how tragedy often begins without spectacle. Michael Jackson was not undone by a clandestine plot, but by the unyielding image of invincibility imposed upon him. The deeper truth lies there: a black artist who spent his life dismantling barriers, ultimately constrained by the very success that defined him. When revisiting those frames, the most disturbing element is not what was concealed, but what was visible from the beginning, had anyone been willing to name it. The man who enters this chapter did not arrive under lights, before lenses, or with any trace of celebrity. He came quietly, through private access points and closed appointments, bearing a simple assurance. He was there to help Michael rest, to help him make it through another day. Inside a secluded room, far removed from the glare of the stage, that promise sounded reasonable, necessary even. At this point, Michael was not seeking a miracle. He was seeking relief for a body long conditioned to operate beyond its limits. The irony was unmistakable. An icon defined by motion and energy, now reliant on carefully managed stillness. It was here that the public began to assign shape to the idea of a real killer, though the reality, when examined, proved far more layered and far less cinematic. Subsequent verification made clear that the arrangement between Michael and his personal physician was anything but standard medical care. This was not a hospital environment, nor was it overseen by a full clinical team. Treatment occurred in isolation behind closed doors. The physician was engaged to address Michael's chronic inability to sleep naturally, an issue later confirmed by family members. On paper, it appeared to be a short-term solution to an extreme workload. In practice, however, care without structured oversight creates inherent risk. This is not conjecture. It is borne out by judicial findings that established medical decisions were made in conditions falling short of accepted safety protocols. There was no elaborate scheme, only a progression of flawed choices made without scrutiny. To Michael, that physician initially represented stability. He needed reassurance that his body could still function, that with the right adjustments, he could meet expectations once more. Family accounts describe Michael as deeply trusting of those within his inner circle, particularly when they projected calm certainty. Though not captured on tape, this aligns with a well-documented psychological pattern. Exhaustion breeds dependence on reassurance. For a black artist who had spent decades justifying his existence under relentless skepticism, the words, "I'll handle it," carried extraordinary weight. The tragedy lies in that trust being placed within a framework lacking adequate safeguards. As speculation intensified, the physician was recast online as a convenient antagonist. The narrative became reductive, a single figure behind a closed door controlling a legend's fate. The verified record tells a harsher, more uncomfortable story. In 2011, a court found him responsible for involuntary manslaughter, based not on intent, but on professional negligence. That verdict dismantled the notion of a calculating mastermind and replaced it with a far more sobering conclusion. Catastrophic outcomes do not require malice. They require complacency, misjudgment, and environments that tolerate risk. Trial evidence demonstrated that the physician operated without meaningful support, making high-stakes decisions alone, under pressure to ensure continuity. To keep the machinery moving, that pressure mirrored what Michael himself was carrying. Two individuals, each constrained by role and expectation, became participants in a dangerous feedback loop. This interpretation unsettles audiences because it denies them a singular villain. It forces acknowledgement of shared vulnerability, even as the consequences were borne by one man alone. For a public accustomed to seeing Michael scrutinized for his race, his appearance, and his difference, reducing the story to one culprit felt both familiar and deeply unsatisfying. There were reports that in his final days Michael expressed unease about dependence on this form of care, but such claims remain absent from official records and should be treated cautiously. Even without them, the established facts are stark enough. A global icon caught between the imperative to perform and the biological need for rest. A physician caught between personal loyalty and professional obligation, and a system devoid of essential fail-safes. In this frame, the real killer is not a person, but a convergence of circumstance, decision-making failures, and prolonged silence. At the time, however, the public was not prepared to accept such an answer. Assigning a face to blame offered emotional simplicity. Those following this stage of the story often experience a mix of anger and powerlessness. The impulse is to believe that one altered decision might have changed everything. What the record reveals instead is a chain of ordinary choices, each made in good faith, none recognized as catastrophic until it was too late. The tension lies not in dramatic acts, but in their banality. Trust became habit. Habit replaced caution. No one paused to ask whether the structure itself was safe. In hindsight, the lesson is difficult to absorb. Tragedies of this scale are often assembled from details everyone assumed were acceptable. By this point, the narrative has moved beyond any fixation on leaked footage. The question is no longer whether a hidden tape exists, but how events unfolded in plain view, documented, verified, and yet misunderstood until irreversibility set in. Michael Jackson was not merely preparing for a return, he was entangled in a network of failing judgments. As that realization took hold, public emotion shifted, from curiosity to grief, from outrage to a hollow resignation. Because if the real killer is not an individual, then accountability extends outward to systems, to expectations, and to the way society elevates its icons without building mechanisms to protect them. The truth, when it finally surfaced, lacked the volume of the headlines that had long promised revelation. It did not resemble a cold, calculated conspiracy, nor did it hinge on a single explosive act that could neatly absorb public outrage. Instead, it unfolded slowly, methodically, and with a distinctly human cruelty. When official records were released and independent evaluations examined side by side, the picture that emerged was not of an assassin, but of a biological chain reaction inside a body pushed beyond endurance. Verified findings showed that Michael Jackson's system reached a point where it could no longer tolerate misguided medical interventions carried out in an environment devoid of proper safeguards. There were no indicators of violence, no evidence of deliberate foul play, only a body reacting catastrophically after being forced for far too long to operate against its natural limits. Ironically, that conclusion left many dissatisfied because it offered no singular target for their anger. The idea of the real killer, then, requires a reframing few were willing to accept. It was not a figure lurking in darkness, it was a process. It began with Michael's chronic inability to rest like an ordinary person, progressed through temporary solutions administered in private, and culminated in a severe physiological collapse. Independent specialists later confirmed that under prolonged stress, even a misjudged intervention can become fatal. This assessment is grounded in documented evidence and sworn testimony, not emotional conjecture. Yet precisely because it felt too ordinary, too devoid of spectacle, it was quickly buried beneath rumor and invention. The public, conditioned to expect villains, struggled to accept that the true failure lay in a private care arrangement operating without oversight. What deepens the tragedy is that in his final days, Michael continued to present himself as a man preparing to perform. Accounts from those around him suggest he still spoke of music, lighting, and delivering perfection to his audience. These recollections do not appear in legal filings and should be treated as personal testimony rather than formal record. Still, they align with what is known. Michael never relinquished his identity as an artist. That creates a cruel paradox, a body in decline paired with a spirit compelled to remain unyielding. For a black artist whose career had been shaped by constant scrutiny and the need to prove legitimacy, sustaining that image was less a choice than a reflex forged over decades. When official conclusions became public, many attempted to reinterpret them, unwilling to accept a narrative without a clear villain. They fixated on fragments and unverified claims, hoping to construct something more dramatic. The legal findings, however, remained unambiguous. Death resulted from a severe physical reaction to inappropriate care decisions made in an unmonitored setting. The personal physician was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, not for malicious intent, but for cumulative professional failures. That distinction does not lessen the outcome, but it fundamentally alters the definition of the real killer. It shifts the focus from an individual to a cautionary lesson about the fragile boundary between care and danger, trust, and professional responsibility. For many observers, this reality produces a sense of anticlimax. They wanted definitive footage, a single moment that exposed everything. What exists instead are reports, analyses, and mundane details that together amount to a profound loss. That very mundanity is what makes the story so unsettling. It reveals how easily tragedy can be avoided and how easily it can occur if one safeguard is missing, one voice fails to intervene. No one believed they were causing harm, yet the consequences were irreversible. For a public that had long consumed Michael as a product rather than a person, this truth landed as a moral reckoning. At a deeper level, the real cause extended beyond biology into the invisible pressures surrounding Michael at the time. The demand for a triumphant return, the need to prove relevance, the prohibition against appearing weak. These forces do not appear in court transcripts, but they are embedded in every rehearsal clip and audio recording. When viewed alongside the official findings, the narrative becomes devastatingly complete. Tragedy does not require conspiracy. It only requires an environment where stopping is not permitted. Within such an environment, even minor errors can produce irreversible outcomes. By this stage, the story no longer hinges on the existence of a secret video. It centers on a harder truth. Facts, when insufficiently dramatic, are often ignored. Michael Jackson did not die in a staged moment or on hidden tape. His death was the culmination of a prolonged process in which body, circumstance, and expectation collapsed at once. Recognizing this leaves audiences unsatisfied by simple explanations and burdened instead with grief. Because if the real killer is a system, a chain of decisions and expectations, then responsibility is diffuse. It belongs to how the world constructed, consumed, and ultimately failed to protect a man carrying more weight than any individual should bear. That realization, slow and unavoidable, is the true conclusion of the story. As the final layers of rumor peeled away, what remained was not a cinematic revelation, but a lasting emptiness felt by those who were left to reckon with it. No piece of leaked footage ever surfaced to deliver a definitive ending. No final image emerged to satisfy public curiosity. Instead, there was a profound silence, the kind that settles in only when people realize they have been asking the wrong questions for far too long. In Michael Jackson's case, the truth did not arrive as a breaking headline. It arrived late, reverberating after there was nothing left to undo. And that delayed clarity is what makes this story linger far longer than any conspiracy theory ever could. Once the official findings, court records, and verified analyses were laid bare, the public was forced to confront an unsettling reality. There was no hidden moment locked away from view, only a process witnessed in fragments and never fully understood in time. The rehearsal recordings, once sensationally branded as leaked footage, now carry a very different weight. They are not breadcrumbs leading to a plot, but quiet evidence of a man pushing forward when his reserves were already depleted. Viewed now, fascination gives way to discomfort and to guilt. Guilt for demanding a flawless return, and guilt for forgetting that behind the word legend stood a human being bound by human limits. Michael's legacy, as a result, is more layered than ever. There is the public legacy, the music, the movement, the moments that transcended race, culture, and geography. And then there is the private cost, far less celebrated, yet inseparable from the triumphs. For a black artist navigating a world shaped by scrutiny and prejudice, projecting strength was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was a means of survival. The deeper tragedy lies in the fact that Michael carried not only his own expectations, but also the aspirations of a community that saw him as proof of boundless possibility. When that symbol revealed fragility, confusion followed, and confusion quickly gave rise to invention. Family members and colleagues later reflected that only in hindsight did the warning signs become clear. The pauses that were too brief, the rehearsals that stretched beyond necessity, the moments when Michael chose silence instead of protest. These observations do not appear in official documentation and should be regarded as personal reflection. Yet, when aligned with the established facts, they form a disturbingly consistent picture. It was not that people deliberately ignored what was happening. It was that they had grown accustomed to Michael always prevailing. And when someone always prevails, the world forgets that stopping may one day be essential. The most difficult realization for audiences at this stage is not about identifying another culprit, but about recognizing their own role. They begin to see how collective expectation, however unintentional, added to the pressure. How rumor traveled faster than understanding. This reckoning is especially heavy for those who felt represented by Michael, who saw in him evidence that someone from the margins could stand at the very center of the world. When the story concludes without a dramatic twist, it leaves behind a stark truth. Icons are not always destroyed by malice, but by unrelenting demand. In hindsight, the idea of the real killer no longer serves as a tool for blame, but as a reflection. It mirrors an entertainment system driven by speed and output, where rest is misread as weakness. It reflects a media culture inclined towards spectacle over nuance. And it reflects the burden placed on a black artist forced to fight for empathy in spaces that rarely offered it freely. There are no victors here, only a costly lesson etched into history. As this chapter closes, what lingers is not the sound of applause, but a quiet regret. Regret that one more pause, one firmer voice willing to put a human life above momentum might have altered everything. But the narrative allows no revisions. What remains are rehearsal tapes, scattered recordings, and a body of work that continues to resonate. Michael Jackson endures in memory, but the story behind the lights now carries added gravity, a reminder that legends are human, and when a human is required to be unbreakable for too long, collapse does not need conspiracy to arrive. That slow, painful understanding is the true conclusion of this journey. After the rumors were stripped away, the narratives inflated and collapsed, and the verified facts finally stood on their own. What remained was not a single perpetrator, but a profoundly human absence. The record of Michael Jackson's final chapter serves as a reminder that behind the glare of global fame stood a man of flesh and blood, subject to limits, exhaustion, and long stretches of silence that went unnoticed. While the public chased sensational revelations, the most telling evidence was often the quietest, the prolonged stillness in which pressure and expectation slowly wore down a legend. If that realization resonates, if you recognize a piece of yourself in this account, consider leaving a like to signal your support, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing as we continue examining the truth that exists behind the spectacle. Empathy, more than outrage, is what ensures these stories are remembered with the seriousness they deserve.
Thank you for watching today's video all the way through. If you found the content helpful, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated to our latest daily videos. Now feel free to check out other feature videos currently